Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for your patience this morning. We are going to get started while we keep letting people in. My name is Jill Elwood. I am the Nonprofit Programming and Relations Manager at the One Valley Community Foundation, where our mission is to connect people who care to causes that matter to build a better community in the Gallatin Valley. We are here for our February Nonprofit Cafe session. We are so thrilled to have all of you join. The goals of Nonprofit Cafe are kind of twofold. Number one is bringing some professional development to our nonprofit sector. And number two is providing an opportunity for networking. I know for our Nonprofit Cafe regulars, you are used to introducing yourselves in the chat box right now. We are going to do that in just a minute when I turn it over to Jonathan, because we also have some icebreaker questions for you this morning. So get your typing fingers ready, but we are going to do that in just a minute. I also do want to mention this is our only session this year that we are bringing a speaker in from out of our region, and we are so excited to bring Jonathan in. And his reputation precedes him in such an awesome way that we actually have people joining us today from across the country, from California to Vermont, which is also pretty rare for our Nonprofit Cafe program. So as we go into our breakout rooms, if you are with someone from outside of our little Southwest Montana nook, I hope you will welcome them and make them feel comfortable for joining their first ever Nonprofit Cafe session. Before we dive in, I have a couple announcements and a couple of housekeeping items. Announcements, I'm going to announce it every chance I get until it closes. Give Big registration, ladies and gentlemen, is currently open and closes March 15th. That is our community-wide fundraiser and celebration of giving. So please, please, please do not forget to register before March 15th. Second announcement, yesterday, the One Valley Community Foundation opened the grant applications for the 100 Strong program. That is our giving circle that funds capital campaigns. So if you are a nonprofit in the Gallatin Valley looking to have a capital campaign, I highly encourage you to check that out. Applications are open until March 20th. Let's see, next we just have a couple of housekeeping items. We want to give a huge shout out, as always, to our sponsors for making this program possible. Our headline sponsor, First Security Bank, and our in-kind sponsors, Bozeman Public Library Foundation and Rockford Coffee, who make our in-person programming possible. Thank you to all of them. Reminders, although I think you all have the hang of this by now, when you are not chatting, if you could keep yourselves muted, the mute button is in the bottom left corner of your chat bar. And then if you could be ready, we are going to do 2 breakout rooms today, and we would love to see who people are chatting with. So when we do go into our breakout rooms, if you could turn your video on for that, we would so deeply appreciate it. And those will be happening later in the session. And let's see, and then the chat box, if you don't know where it is right in the middle of your bar at the bottom. We will have some opportunities here in just a minute to chat in and introduce yourselves, and Jonathan's going to ask us some icebreaker questions. With that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today. In prepping for this session, I reached out to some folks that I really trust to say, you know, I really want to bring a session on equity, inclusivity, empathy, and a local nonprofit representative said, you have to talk to Jonathan. And I'm so grateful that she recommended him, because just in planning this session, I have already learned so much from him. And I'm so excited for him to share his knowledge and experience with all of you today. Jonathan Santos Silva has been a troublemaking, system-breaking leader in the education space for over 12 years. While he is most recently known for his work as the founder of the Liber Institute and chairman of the Board of Ed podcast, Jonathan can also be credited with contributions to the Cambiar Catalyst Fellowship for Aspiring School System Leaders and South Dakota's Native American Achievement Schools. Jonathan has been recognized for his work as a classroom teacher, founding school leader, and leadership coach, and is sought after due to his engaging and uplifting style. We are so thrilled to bring him to you all today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan, let him kind of introduce himself, and we will dive into some icebreakers with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill. And thank you, everybody. It's awesome to be here. I wish I could actually be in Montana. Let me just be honest and get that right off the top. I would much rather be with you in person. But it is what it is. This is the world we live in. I'm thrilled to be with you all to talk about equity. I'm excited about the fact that there's a large community of folks there that want to explore this with me. I hope that it'll be fun. I hope that it'll be thought-provoking, and in the end, I hope that everybody walks away with a tool that they can use to help build a better organization. As Jill said, my name is Jonathan Santos Silva. I'm the founder of the Liber Institute, and what I am most proud of is that we're an organization that is set out to support Indigenous school communities through transformation. And why I'm proud of it is that our board is constructed of all Indigenous people. We have Native people on our staff, and we constantly are focused on listening deeply and doing work with communities and not to them. And if it was a really snowy or rainy or crappy weather day and I couldn't go outside, like today, actually, you can't see it, but I can see all the sleet coming down. I would recommend that we watch either Raising Dion, which is one of my favorite shows on Netflix, or anything in the Power universe, which is like my guilty pleasure. When all the kids are asleep, my wife and I watch like stuff like that, or snowfall. So, and the reason I share that is because when we get into our introductions, I'm going to want you to introduce yourself the same way. But before I do that, in case there's anybody who wants to follow along, right, whether that is because your own individual learning needs, you want to be able to read the slides, or if you want to have a copy of them for later, I have the bit.ly link down in the bottom left corner, and it's going to be on almost every slide. It's after the bit.ly is One Valley Ramp, which builds off our title today. So if you want to pull this up on a second screen or on your phone or your tablet, it's going to be bit.ly/One Valley Ramp. No capitals. Bit.lys are sensitive, so I tried to make it as easy as possible. One Valley Ramp. Once you get, and it's on this slide as well. So if you're still catching up, it's bit.ly/One Valley Ramp if you want to follow along. You don't have to. And once you get it, if you are looking for it, I would like you to introduce yourself in the chat. And I want you to do it the same way I did. So your name, what you do and what you're most proud of, and your recommendation for something to either watch, to read, or to listen to. That could be music, podcast, audiobook on a really bad weather day. And to go ahead and throw that in the chat. And while you're doing that, just take a peek and make sure your Zoom name is you. I know that a lot of us are sharing Zoom with children or partners. I was in a meeting the other day, and my friend showed up as his wife, and so he got razzed for about 15 minutes. So just make sure you have the right name. So especially in case I want a cold call, I am a teacher at heart. So I want to invite you into the conversation. I want to make sure I invite you and not your husband or your wife or your partner. So just take a minute to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. So welcome, Bridget and Christina. Ooh, Cast. I haven't heard of that one. That must be a good one. Deborah, welcome, Deborah. And Hannah, Queer Eye. My mom was telling me to watch Queer Eye last night, Hannah. So you're on the same wavelength with my mom.
She was right.
Alisa and Jill, Marielle. Hey, Marielle. Mrs. Meisel. That's the one about the comedian, right? Yeah, I've heard good things about that. That's on Amazon Prime. I have to step up my Amazon Prime game. I got to be honest with you. If I don't know what to watch, that's like the last one I go to. I got to switch it up. Price says Ozark. My brother loves Ozark. I have to check that one out. Dakota. Ooh, Christine Harrison podcast. I have to put that. Alisa says RuPaul's Drag Race. Okay. Kristen, Laura, Hannah, Courtney, and Susan. Welcome. The Great British. Now, was that a team recommendation, or did Kristen kind of commandeer that and just make the recommendation? So that's the question. Sally, she wants to be out rain or shine. See, I knew that being in Montana, there's some of you would say snowy day, be inside. What? I'll be out on a slope somewhere. I knew that. I knew that was coming. Asia has been listening to the Nonprofit Mastermind. I may need to check that one out. Thank you, Bridget. So if you want to learn more about CAST, you put the link. Linda from the Bozeman Art Museum. Welcome, welcome, Faye. All right, I'm not going to go through everybody, but you should. You should. Some cool people with some great recommendations in the room. So, and just so you know, I am very low tech here right now. Okay, well, low high, kind of in the middle. So I have a deck here on the screen that you can see. And then because I'm trying to keep up with the notes and make sure I'm giving you all the good stuff, I have it over here. So if I start advancing slides in our fashion, you know what's happening. I'm getting my monitors confused. But anyway, let's jump into it. On one evening in the early 1970s, Michael Petrovis and a few friends wheeled themselves to a curb in Berkeley, California, poured cement into the form of a crude ramp, and rolled off into the night. For Petrovis and his fellow disability advocates, it was a political act, an act of defiance. The police threatened to arrest us, he recalled, but they didn't. It was also pragmatic. Despite their unevenness, the makeshift sloping curbs provided the disabled community with something invaluable: mobility. At the time, getting around Berkeley, or really any American city, in a wheelchair was not easy. The Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 required government buildings to make themselves universally accessible, but traversing streets in a wheelchair resembled the running of an obstacle course. Wheel to the driveway in an alley or at a loading dock, roll into the street until you reach another driveway, hope all the while that a truck doesn't pull out and hit you. Students with disabilities at the University of California, Berkeley, housed in Cowell Hospital, which was the only space that could accommodate them, planned their classes, and check this out, this is sad. They had to plan their classes schedules based on which class was downhill from the last one. That's how they made their schedules. Yet this was Berkeley in the era of political activism. There was a free speech movement, an anti-war movement, a civil rights movement. And so Michael and his friends thought, why not a movement for movement? Pressed by disability activists, in 1972, the city installed its first official curb cut at an intersection on Telegraph Avenue. It would become, in the words of one of the advocates, the slab of concrete heard around the world. I think about this story as a metaphor or as a picture of equity for a number of reasons. Because the idea is that oftentimes what makes our systems or our organizations inaccessible or not welcoming to people aren't always things that are readily visible. As an able-bodied person with full use of my legs, I don't think about ramps. I use them, but I don't think about them. So you can see how it really takes understanding how people who use wheelchairs live their lives to realize the true value of these ramps. That's what it took. I want to ask you though, as you think about all these many years later, ramps are ubiquitous. Who else benefits from curb cuts in our sidewalks? And you can come off mute if you wanted to shout it out, or you can throw it in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Bridget said people with strollers. Rachel seconded that, moms with strollers. Hannah, people pushing babies with strollers. See, that's a popular one. Yep, everybody's rolling. Kids on bikes, people using crutches, delivery people with dollies, folks who assist people with limited mobility. Exactly. I'll give a couple more seconds. See, skateboarders, yes. Bikes, folks with walkers, rollerblades. We still rollerblading out in these streets? Is that what's going on? Elderly people. I mean, my kids, I have an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And it's like skateboards and the little hoverboard thingies that I'm just like, oh my God, don't even get me near that thing. I'll be injured. I would need the curb cut sidewalk after that. Elderly people, blind people. Yeah, like that yellow panel that you see in the curb cut on the picture, that shows folks who are blind or have limited visibility, that shows them where to stop, right? So you're right, it helps a lot of people, dogs with wheelchairs. Yes, so a ton of people, right? So what started off as advocacy by the disability rights community to make our streets more accessible for folks who use wheelchairs really makes life easier for tons of people, tons of people. And at the point now where we can't even, could you even imagine a world that if we went back and we had all these crazy old janky curbs that didn't have any ramps, people wouldn't have that anymore. But it took those first disability resource activists to get us going. Yes, making adjustments for vulnerable people helps everyone. Yes. And Dakota, I appreciate that. And Kyla, everyone, when communities can welcome great people with different abilities, totally. So that was the curb cut, or the slab of concrete heard around the world. I want to tell you about the desk setup heard around the, okay, well, no, people didn't hear about my classroom from around the world, but it helped my classroom. Let me tell you about it. About 12 years ago, I got into the classroom. I actually taught on the Pine Ridge Reservation. I was a high school math teacher. I was Teach for America Corps member. And when I got my classroom, it kind of looked like this one. The desks were set out in rows, and I wasn't necessarily where I am today in terms of dynamic classroom setup and liberatory classroom environments, but I knew that rows weren't going to cut it. However, I left them that way at the beginning because I said, let the kids come in, and as I get to know my students and how we work together, maybe we can do it as a democratic process. How do we want our room to look? However, I learned pretty quickly, I had 2 students who were deaf. And for a number of reasons, I wasn't quite prepared for that. I went through the public school system, K-12. I had never had a deaf classmate. I come from Massachusetts originally, where, the East Coast, where we would have like a school for the deaf. And so most people who would have needs associated with being deaf had a special environment. So when I realized I had 2 students, I didn't have any exposure, even as a student, with, well, what did my teachers do to accommodate learners who are deaf? And so I went to my most trusted resource, my wife, who is a special educator, which was helpful in this in this situation, but it's also helpful in life because she has to deal with me every day. But she said, in order to make the classroom more accessible for my deaf students, I might try a U-shaped classroom. Now, and the reason for that was explained to me is this: for many of our deaf students, especially mine, so my 2 deaf students, for a number of reasons, chose not to wear hearing aids. They did not want to be, identified or ostracized or picked on. And so over the years, they were in high school. Over the years, they had learned to read lips very well, or pretty well. And so by making the class a U, they were not either at the front, right, to read my lips and make it easier for them to understand me, but then everyone is behind them. And anytime they want to hear what a classmate says, they need to turn around. Or they weren't in the back, and no mouths are available to them. In a U, it's not ideal. They can't see everybody, but they can see at least a half the class at any given time, and made it easier for them. They were less likely to have to be on a swivel all the time to turn back and forth to see kids. But I want to ask you, in making this room more accessible to my deaf students, does anyone have any thoughts on other types of students who may have benefited from this U setup? And I want to be clear, as we're thinking this way, I hope what I don't want the unintended consequences to think that I'm thinking of people only by these labels. It's really more only just to identify the ways that when we accommodate, as I think it was, who was it? Dakota said, when we make adjustments for certain folks, it benefits other folks. That's all I mean to say. But I don't want to make it seem like these kids were only deaf, or these other kids are only whatever we label them. So please apologize if it comes across that way. Everyone more conducive to general discussion, sensory sensitive students, people who need to leave quickly, they don't have to stumble over desks. All students, it's easier to communicate and create community. Perhaps introverts or folks less willing to speak are more included. People who have trouble focusing, students who have experienced trauma. So you're identifying a lot of great students, all of the above. I also noticed, oddly enough, that extroverted students benefited. Right, the kids who want to, they're always the first hand up or the one that blurts. When they could see everyone, they were engaged by more than just me. So they weren't always just vying for the attention of me at the front. They were engaged in listening to others. And so for all the reasons that you talked about, this classroom setup made our math class a much richer learning environment. It was probably the heaviest, heaviest conversation math class in the school, because we were always oriented to look at each other. It never was just sit there and do worksheets. So thank you all for participating in that. So what we're going to do now, we're going to do our first breakout in small groups, and these are going to be random groups. So when you get in there, you want to make sure you introduce yourself again. Introduce yourself, where you're coming in from. If you want to make a quick recommendation, if you have another recommendation to your peers, right? Do that. And by the way, I ask silly questions, seemingly silly questions like this, like, what are you reading and watching, or how do you do this, or what do you do with that? Because it's just another way to make a positive impression. Oh yeah, Jill likes, and remember what she watches, right? Remember what she listens to, and it helps me remember people. So make sure you do that. And we're gonna have about 3 minutes, and I'd like you to think about, try to come up as a group with at least three examples when the curb cut effect made life or work easier for the intended beneficiaries and others, right? And if possible, as we're it's becoming clear, we know that everybody in the community benefits when we're more sensitive, but try to think specifically about groups of people who were the unintended beneficiary of whatever innovation that you're talking about. And so they can be physical, like the classroom setup or the curb cut, or they could be like accommodations or changes in how your organization presents events or the type of services you offer. So try to come up with at least 3 in your group, but make sure that you introduce yourself, where you're from, and get to know everybody.
Perfect. I will blast everyone out into those breakout rooms in just a minute. I do want to mention these are small breakout rooms. And I know some people, for whatever reason, are not able to actively participate in breakout rooms. So if I put you in a breakout room and the person does not join you, I'll keep an eye on that, and I might pop you after about 30 seconds into a different breakout room. So if you're sitting there by yourself, I will move you. And if you have any issues, feel free to come back to the main room, let me know, and I'm happy to blast you back out into a different room as well. So you all should now have an invitation to join your breakout rooms, and we will see you in 3 to 4 minutes.
Awesome. I'm in a group where we often are in and out of breakouts, and folks started calling that, that very jarring pullback. They started calling it the rapture. Like, oh, I got raptured back into the class, like mid-sentence. So it sounds like some folks were raptured. And so we apologize. But I do want to hear from some of I only got to make it to one group. 3 minutes goes by way faster than you think, especially when the conversation is so good. But I got to meet Asia and Anna, and I wanted to invite Anna to share an example, and then want to invite others before we get back into PowerPoint mode. See, that shows you how old we're getting, because who even uses PowerPoint anymore? But I called it a PowerPoint. Oh, you do, Jill? Okay. So Microsoft thanks you. The rest of us are on Google Docs. No, I'm just kidding. Faye too. Okay. But yes, Anna, would you share your example and of who it was intended to support, and another group of people that you think are benefiting from the innovation or the curb cut?
Yeah, so we talked about 2 things. The first was I work with special needs kids, and I remembered at the beginning of the pandemic, they got masks that have a clear piece of plastic over the mouth, because it's really important for kids like that to be able to see facial expressions and to see mouth movements. And so we talked about how that can be beneficial for them. It could be beneficial for people with hearing disabilities. And also we talked about how kids with trauma and could benefit from that, in that they need to be able to see facial recognition or facial expression to be able to, connect with people. And so I thought those were really good ideas. Asia also shared that in the building of the new shelter for Haven, they've thought a lot about accessibility, making that, ramps, things for people that can't use their hands, that kind of stuff. And we talked about how that can be really beneficial for staff as well, if they have a bunch of stuff in their hands and they need to be able to help someone that having, touchless items can be beneficial for, everyone involved.
Thank you, Anna. Is there a representative from another group that would like to share? Yeah.
I'll jump in.
Sure.
One thing is family bathrooms are helpful for people who are transgender, who are looking for a gender neutral bathroom, and for people with disabilities who need a bigger space, or someone who assists someone with disabilities who needs a bigger space. So that's one. We also talked about closed captioning in our group and how that was intended for people who are hard of hearing, but it can help a number of people in a variety of ways to still access content without having to hear.
That's excellent, Dee. Thank you so much. Do you have maybe one more?
I can share one.
Awesome.
So at Morningstar in the last year, we implemented a tuition assistance program that was needs-based instead of what had previously been done, which was a flat discount amount for every family. And so the intended beneficiary was families who had more financial need and for them to be able to have more affordability of our services. But we also found that enrollment amongst those families went up. And so those children were getting more care. Those families were able to work more. So in our tiny town that is really struggling from a staffing shortage, the businesses and, overall, not just employers, but employees who struggle when they're short staffed, right, were able to benefit. And really all of the children, whether they were receiving, obviously they don't really know if they're on discounts or not, but they get to spend more time with their friends every day, whether they are receiving a discount or not. So we saw really benefits across the spectrum of the community.
That's beautiful, Mario. I love that. It's like when people are advocating for public transportation lines, and you're thinking about underserved communities and how do they have access to the economic centers. Not only did those families, excuse me, sorry, not only do those families and individuals benefit from the transportation opportunity, but now all those businesses in the economic centers have access to workers or to consumers. So like your example, giving folks access to your school was just the beginning of all of the layers of benefit. And so I'm going to go back to the screen share. Hold on a second. Oh, great. Now my slide, there we go. And so what I want us to remember is that curb cut thinking will lead to widespread benefit, but that isn't the goal. The goal is equity for those being denied equity. And so we do this work because there are folks who are historically left out. We know that there are others who will benefit, but we always want to keep our minds on those folks. How we do better by making equitable organizations and equitable communities. So this is the awesome start of the conversation. And so before I go any further, I want to just, if you may notice, I'm not doing a lot of vocabulary talk. Like we're not going to do microaggressions. We're not going to talk about all of the, anti-racist. What does it mean to be what is an anti-racist policy? What is it? I just don't feel like most people learn that way. If you want to do that, you can do a book group. And I think that can be a powerful way to learn. Excuse me. But for this, we're in community. I want us to learn in community. I want us to do something. I want you to walk away with something you could use. But I do want to make a different, clear something. Oftentimes, when we start talking about equity, especially when we're talking about gender equity, whether that's pay equity or making sure women are represented equally in our organizations, or racial equity, you will hear voices of people who want to push equality. Well, everybody has the same access. I don't know what the problem is. And so I found the quote that helps make it very clear. And I think will hopefully, just galvanize you as you're thinking about how you bring this work forward in your organization. And the quote was, and it's in the link. So if you pull up the One Valley rant and you go to slide 5 in the notes, you'll see the article if you want to read more about it. But the quote was, equality gives everyone the right to ride on the bus. Equity ensures that there are curb cuts so people in wheelchairs can get to the bus stop, and lifts so they can get on the bus and ensures that there are bus lines where people need them so they can get where they need to go. And I know that all of our examples are in that realm of physical disabilities, and I don't want to gloss over it. When Marielle talked about making her school more accessible, we're talking about socioeconomic barriers. In equitably distributing the funds instead of everyone gets the same amount, that was giving those families, that was cutting the curb, that was giving them the lift on the bus. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with those families, and there's nothing wrong with the person in the wheelchair. There's something wrong with our design. We haven't thought about these folks, and so we need to do better. That's what I'm saying. Let's continue. So what I want to introduce you to is a tool called an empathy interview, which I think can help. Because if you are like me, you're already thinking about the profiles of individuals or communities that your organization serves right now, that maybe we're not doing as well as we could. Or you also maybe have profiles of people that you're like, we want to serve that community and we just have never gotten traction. But Jonathan, how do I figure out how to make our organization more accessible if I really don't have a deep relationship with folks in that community? How do I do something that will honor them and that they will respond to in a positive way, as opposed to trying to do something that is a token gesture or a really only surface level? And that's where we get into empathy interviews. Does anybody have exposure or experience conducting empathy interviews? I see Marielle's hands up. Somebody said, oops, in the chat, that was my daughter. Let me just tell you, if you have a lovely daughter or child that is in the room with you and they jump on screen, just let us know. We love seeing kids. We don't have any problem with that. Shoot, you're lucky that my kids aren't here. They'd be all in the screen. You wouldn't even see me. All four of them would be up here. So yes, your children are welcome. But yes, does anybody have experience with empathy interviews? I know Marielle raised her hand. Anybody else? Sorry, who was that? I just saw Kate kind of giving me like a, yeah, a little bit. Okay, cool. Very cool. And maybe there's others. Empathy interviews are the foundation of whether you're talking about design thinking, human-centered design, liberatory design, whatever you call it. And they're practiced and taught by a number of organizations and institutions like the Stanford D School, IDEO. My goodness. A second. Stanford D School, IDEO, and ComBR Education. Empathy interviews are used to gather insights that otherwise might not be apparent. These insights can then be used to identify issues and generate potential solutions. So if, for example, you're running an organization for, I think it was Asia, was talking about her organization supports folks who have experienced domestic and sexual violence. You may look at your population, and I'm just making this up. I don't know this, and so I don't in any way want to say that this is what Asia is experiencing. But she may say, we have a lot of folks from, you know, this community, but we don't have anybody from the south side of town. Or we have a lot of white families and women and families who are taking it. We don't have any native folks in from our community taking advantage. Or you could say our program, we have a lot of, like Marielle's program, we have a lot of families represented. We didn't have a lot of low income families. So you, whatever that, however you identify that, the next step isn't to say, well, what would this type of person or this group or this sort of family need, and then solve it by ourselves. Because what we do is introduce bias about what we think someone else's needs or pain points are. And we could do that with the best intention. So I don't mean bias as like, you know, like we're harboring ill will, but our bias of our experiences. I am a perfectly able-bodied male. I'm a Black male. I grew up, you know, in a working class family, but with a lot of opportunity. So I am going to see the world that way. So when, for example, going back to Asia's example, when she said we're putting leather straps on the doors, I grew up, I didn't even know where she was going next. I didn't know who that was going to help. I didn't know what that was for. And as soon as she said, well, some people who lack fine motor skills will be able to open a door, or they don't have hands or fingers, I was like, makes a lot of sense. But I didn't have access to that community. I didn't know it. So that's what I mean when I say we're going to introduce our bias, just that we have limited perspective. We only can see the world the way we see it. But by conducting empathy interviews, somebody welcomes me into their world. I start to see the world a little bit more broadly. It's like the light bulb comes on. I start to see. Now I will go to buildings now forever from today, Asia, thank you so much. And I will look and say, we don't, what about all these doorknobs, right? I'll start to notice, and I'll never unsee it, but it started with being in relation to someone who lives a different life and has a different set of experiences. That's what empathy interviews can help us to do. And so there are some tips that I want to give you to about empathy interviews. And so when we do empathy interviews, basically as a high level, I would, if I'm sitting in if I'm empathy interviewing Bridget, I sit with her for 35 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, and I ask her questions to try to elicit specific stories, right? So instead of saying, something like, Bridget, let's say, I'm trying to think of a good example that would cross over. We're talking about nonprofits. Let's say, hey, Bridget, tell me about the type of events, the type of nonprofit and community events you usually go to. She'll start generalizing. Oh, I like to go to events where there's a lot of people. Oh, actually, go ahead, Bridget. Go ahead. You jump right in. You came off mute. Go ahead.
Dang
I
it.
didn't mean to put you on the spot, but go ahead.
I mean, in terms of nonprofit events, typically they're fundraising events. So golf tournaments, galas. So I would say that is a common nonprofit event that I might attend.
Okay. Now, instead of asking that general, because she said typically, generally, usually, if I ask her, Bridget, tell me about a specific event you recently attended where you felt you learned something valuable.
Ooh. Dang. I attended a Montana Nonprofit Association town hall meeting that I had the privilege of presenting at, but also got to listen to other panelists talk about some federal funding, ARPA funding from the federal government that's going to be trickling down to communities, and how nonprofit leaders can potentially leverage this funding to support their work. So I learned a little bit about how county governments work, what county officials need to know in order to help support nonprofits with this funding.
Awesome. Did y'all notice anything? When I asked Bridget, tell me about typical, usual, whatever, she was like ready. And when I made it very specific about an event where she learned something valuable, it was like, she slowed down and she started to bring me a story. And so that's one of the number one tips of empathy interviews. We want to frame questions that yield stories, right? So even as basic as if I ask Sally, tell me about your morning routine, she could generalize. Well, usually I get up, I sit by the windowsill, I read a little, then I grab a coffee. But if I say, tell me about, how did you get ready for work today? Slow down. Well, gee, my alarm didn't go off, so I jumped up, like starts to get specific. And now I can start to, well, I'm not going to get any further, but you just see the type of detail, right? That I can begin to probe if I want to. I can begin to get deeper into emotions. So the first tip is seek specific stories, past or present. So I said to Bridget recent, but I didn't have to say recent. I usually say recent because it just like kind of, narrows us in an area, but it could be at any time. Why do we do this? It avoids implicit bias and it recognizes people based on their specific personal attributes, right? By asking Bridget to get specific about a story, it's her story. I'm not able to reintroduce or I'm less likely to reintroduce my bias. It also shifts my understanding of the issue away from averages, like what it's typically like at these events, or what it's usually like, and also away from jargon towards real life examples and experiences. And if you imagine, if I asked every single one of you that same question that I asked Bridget, for her, it was that one about the specific type of funding. For you, it would be something else. And I could start to glean, what is it about these events that made them so valuable? I can ask about what the presentation style was. How did they engage you? There's so many ways I could go. And how do we do it? Instead of using, how do you usually, what do you generally, I can ask things like, tell me about a time when, or tell me a story about how. Those are some ways that I can get to specific stories. Oh, whoops. And also, I'm going through these, but if you ever need me to slow down or you want to ask a question, you don't have to save it to the end. I'm not a rule follower. Let me just jump in the chat real quick. Alexandra, makes me think of how for a long time I heard things like I asked how he, she, they were today, and they told me a story. I was just being kind. I didn't really want to know, right? Right? Like, yeah, like we do want to know in this case. In an empathy interview, you do want to know. And so it's very counter to the surface level that we engage people, right? How was that for you? Yeah, it was fine. Fine doesn't tell me anything. But getting to a story is like a treasure trove. That's what I want you to look at. When people sit with you for an empathy interview, they're giving you something super valuable, their time and their personal experience. So the next one is follow up with why, or tell me about a time when. So I often do this one backwards. I ask for tell me about a time, and then I go for why. So what I was like, even though it was kind of impromptu, I just used Bridget because she was the first person on my screen, and then she came off. So then we just did it. But then I saw my energy started going. I wanted to ask her, how did they convey this information? Why was it so valuable? How did you feel, when you were like those are all these questions that come out. And by asking why, it avoids the implicit bias that arises from making assumptions, right? Like I could make an assumption, oh, Bridget found it valuable because she'd never heard about this thing. That might not be true at all. She may have heard about it and no one ever just presented it as well as this person. So then when I asked her why, let me ask you that, Bridget, why was that so valuable or helpful?
I'm actually pretty well versed in it, but what was really helpful was getting to hear from somebody speaking on behalf of county government to tell their perspective of how to work with a county government. So I think getting to understand that lived experience was really helpful.
See? So I made an assumption right on top of my head. She probably didn't know much about it. She actually knew a lot about it. And had I stayed in my bias zone, I would have went off and designed a solution potentially, or taken an approach that wouldn't have met Bridget's real needs. That's why we ask why. You get to the root cause or set of underlying beliefs that explain someone's perspective. You'll see this when we get into the cheat sheet that I made to help you start generating questions. All of my questions, or most of my questions, are rooted in the school experience. And we're talking about educators where the expectation is we know everything, right? That is one of the I would say characteristics of educators is we're so often expected to have answers that we're very good at kind of projecting an answer. Kids upset, oh, it must be because of blah 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 blah. No, why don't you ask the question? Why are you so angry? If the kid says I'm angry, why are you feeling angry? What happened before you got to my class? What did she do? What did he do? What do you wish they had done? Right? Like these types of follow-ups with why and tell me about help you get beneath the surface and away from your bias or your constructed rationale. Ask why. And so how you do this is by asking why unashamedly. Marielle will remember this because we worked together, or she was on staff and I was going through a program, and we talked about the 5 whys. And there's a really funny example of when the Lincoln Memorial, I don't know if y'all have ever been to DC, looks like the back of the penny. He's sitting there, poop everywhere, poop everywhere, birds. And so they have janitors that go in there, clean it up, and poop everywhere again. And so they started asking why. Why is there so much poop on the Lincoln Memorial? Birds. So they captured the birds, moved the birds away, was clean for a few weeks, and then poop everywhere. So then they asked, why are there so many birds here? There were bugs. So then they sprayed mosquitoes, repellent, whatever. Birds go away, mosquitoes go away, mosquitoes come back, birds come back, poop everywhere. Why are there so many bugs here? The lights, they're attracted to the lights. So do you know what their high-tech solution for keeping poop off of the Lincoln Memorial was? Turn the lights off at night. So just ask why, unashamedly. Don't be afraid. Equity is complex, right? Making sure that we are really being, we're understanding and empathetic, and we know our community. But sometimes when you ask people directly, you will be presented with the seemingly simplest, low-hanging fruit. You're like, oh my God, why didn't I see this? So just do it unashamedly. Whoops. And then the third one, and these are not the only tips, these are just some There it is. Dig for emotion. Dig for emotion. Why do we do this? We dig for emotion because it keeps you grounded in real life stories of joy, pain, success, and failure, right? Stories that are like kind of run of the mill can be helpful, but when you can get to a real pain point or an experience of a thrill of success, you can really mine and get into the why. So I remember I interviewed a parent. It was a Native parent. So I lived for a long time in Rapid City. Rapid City is a community where Rapid City, South Dakota, 20% of the student population is Native. There's the largest community of students of color, and less than 1% of staff is Native. And so there are just a lot of opportunities for us to get better at equity, right? To start to ask questions about even why aren't more Native folks applying? Why aren't more Native folks in leadership roles? Why aren't they in our classroom? Just a number of things, because not only would our Native students learn a lot, but there are white students and other non-Native students who would benefit. There's a whole lot of South Dakota's history and culture that belongs to Native communities that our kids aren't getting access to, right? So there's just a lot of opportunity. So I talked to this mom and I asked her and a bunch of other parents, tell me about a time when, school really met your child's needs. And a bunch of parents were, oh, this particular mom, she was thinking about her son who had some learning differences. And she had a moment like Bridget, when I switched the question from like, tell me about typical programs to like, tell me about when we learned. She says, for this particular child of mine, I don't think schools ever really met his needs. So then I had to ask her about how that made her feel, and so then we went into examples of when the schools had let her down. And so those are difficult experiences, but in getting to her emotions, what she felt as a mother in those moments and what she did to meet her son's needs, I learned a lot about some of the barriers or obstacles to the families of children with special needs that I wouldn't have learned if I just stayed at a surface level, or if I looked only for, I want this to be a feel-good experience. Now, granted, some of you may work with populations that are dealing with trauma. You always want to make sure that your interviewee knows that he or she is in control. They do not have to answer any question, and it's in the script. But if they're open to going with you, sometimes those difficult stories can be a space of a lot of education. So displays and stories of emotion signal real pain points, tensions, and motivations for individual stakeholders that may not be readily apparent. So how you do this is by asking your interviewee how they felt in a specific moment, right? So after, Bridget goes into like, the information about how the county executive kind of made it more clear, she kind of understood how to navigate that. So how did you feel? I can ask her that. Bridget, how did you feel? How did you feel, and what did it make you want to do?
I felt more empowered and educated to not only help support our organization, but other nonprofits throughout the county in terms of how they can work with their county governments.
Was there anything about this specific event and how they conveyed the information that was different from the typical event?
I think what was helpful was that it was a panel discussion. So there was a variety of perspectives that were presented.
See, now I really just want to interview her about this more, because I just get so connected to her and her story and her experience. So imagine doing this with 10 or 20 or 30 people that are already in relationship with your organization and what you would learn. And so that's what I'm going to challenge you to do. Whoops. Jill, can I get a time check? I just want to make sure I don't bulldoze through your closeout.
Good. It is 9:56, so we have 34 minutes left.
Okay, awesome. So what I'd like to do is I would like to get y'all in a moment, not right away, because I want to take questions, but I want to set you up so you can make sure you ask the questions to get ready. And so there's some good questions in the chat, so I'll make sure I answer those as well. I want you to start thinking about the profiles of community members that might be out on the margins of your organization. So there's a resource that I linked to the cheat sheet. It's called from a group called Equity by Design. And it's a group of women who took design thinking and tried to reimagine it through a lens where equity is the goal and the outcome, right? Design thinking can be used to make a better chair, I have a standing desk. Maybe, someone designed thought about this desk. Doesn't necessarily mean that equity was a desired outcome. When we do equity by design, it is. And so they talk about designing at the margins. So thinking of, and by that, I mean, who is typically pushed to the outskirts of your work? Maybe not on purpose, but just that, for example, you realize we're not serving as many fill in the blank, this type of folks, or this community. We're not serving people from as many people from this community as I would like to. So think about those profiles of people, who they are, whether they are people who use wheelchairs, the deaf community, folks who with learning differences, people of color, and maybe it's a specific group of a community of color, right? Like, so if you're in like Minnesota, for example, which I know we're mostly in Montana, you might be thinking specifically about the Hmong community, or in Rapid City, we would be thinking about indigenous people with emphasis on Lakota and Dakota people. I don't know what it would be in Montana. Would it be, is it Cheyenne? Like, is it Arapaho? Do you have a growing community of Mexican American workers like we did in Sioux Falls that were coming into Sioux Falls? It's the biggest city in South Dakota. A bunch of people moved in. They're working in the meat packing industry, so they're there. But I don't know that Sioux Falls has really made enough shifts to make community navigable for folks who are still learning English. So it could be any number of folks, but think about that profile. And we're going to have time in small groups to start just sketching out potential questions that you would want to ask. So in the same way that I asked Bridget, tell me about a recent time you went to an event, you might want to ask some of these folks, tell me about a recent engagement you had with a governmental or a community-based organization, and you felt that a need was met, or that you felt like you didn't get what you needed. And then you could start to, and those I'm just ripping off the fly. I do have a resource for you. Actually, if you want to pull it up, it's the new bit.ly link at the bottom. It's bit.ly/OneValley cheat sheet. And there are a bunch of examples of questions. I can also just do the, because I have chat, I just put the Google link. It's a view only, just so we don't accidentally change it on anybody. Just make a copy. You start, make a copy and personalize it, customize it. And so just to orient you to it, there are some tips at the top. This is a sample script for how I would introduce my interview. And then there's just a chart full of questions, of example questions. And so when you get into the group, what you're going to do is you're going to work on your own organization, like who profile, and it doesn't have to be a deep profile, just like I would want to talk to, parents from low-income families. Boom. What are the questions? So that might be Mario. What are the questions Mario would want to ask some of these parents or some of the grandparents from these families? And that's what she'll work on. And then we'll give you kind of like we'll send an alert at some point once you've been able to generate a couple of questions. I would love for you to start like sharing them with the other people in your group. But we're going to start with just introduce yourself, take some quiet time to write, and then share. But before we even go into that, let's have some conversation and answer questions. So let me go into the chat. How do you avoid tokenizing people when conducting empathy interviews? I wouldn't want anyone to think, and this is from Kyla. Thank you, Kyla. I wouldn't want anyone to think I imagined they were the official spokesperson for all Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled, LGBTQIA+, et cetera, people. And that's a warning I've heard in the past. That is a perfect question. So when I introduce the empathy interview, like if you look at the cheat sheet, or I can just read it here, I say, I'm from the Liber Institute. This interview is being conducted to help me understand your feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and motivations around your relationship with Red Cloud Indian School, right? So we were working with a bunch of folks who engage with that school. So that's what I would tell them. I am asking you for your experiences and how you interact with this organization, or how you experience this problem, this challenge in the community. And you could even, if that's something, Kyla, that you're specifically concerned about, you could write it in. This is, I'm not asking you to be a spokesman for anyone else. I'm really just interested in your personal experience navigating blank. Because that is a valid thing. We don't want to we don't want to tokenize people. We don't want to do one empathy interview with one single Black guy and go, well, I know what the Black community needs, right? Like that doesn't feel good. But if you say, Jonathan, I want to know your experience attending the blah, blah, blah event, or I want to know what you know, you're feeling, your experience having your kids come to Morning Star. I'm an expert in my experience. If that's what you need from me, I can do that, right? So that's a great question. And I think it just goes back to building rapport at the beginning. And please, Kyla, push back if you feel like I didn't answer the question, or if you have another layer to it, I would love to have that.
I think you answered it really well. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions?
I have a question based on, I'm kind of looking at the sheet that you provided, and I see that there's some, for lack of a better word, like negative faced questions versus positive faced questions. Do you think it's useful to blend those together? So use like, start with when is the time that you felt supportive and when is the time that you didn't feel supported?
Yes. So like if you, so I tried to, Jill was very helpful in pushing me to make sure I tried to pull some examples that were more general and easily kind of, that would hit a number of different nonprofit situations. So I wouldn't follow the first one that says general nonprofit as like a conversation. But yes, when you look at, let me see, like hopefully when you look at the learners and the parents, I always try to ask both. If I'm going to deliberately draw out, you know, a negative situation, right? Like tell me about a time when you felt like your needs were not met in a learning environment. Then I'm going to follow up and I'm going to ask, well, tell me about a time when you did feel like you were well supported, or that you did feel part of a welcoming community. And the reason I do it is because you get different stories and both are important. So it's important that you lift that up, Anna. What you don't want to do is like if you're asking about a specific policy, that's when I don't like to inject emotion or something like that. Like, you know, like I'm trying to think of an example. I would never want to ask a question like, what frustrations do you have with our new, you know, blah, blah, blah policy? Because it automatically puts people into a place where they like dogging out the program or they're dogging out the thing. And it doesn't give them the chance to authentically react, right? Like if you just say, hey, what have been your experience interacting with the new whatever policy, you know, the new dress code or the new whatever. And I'm going back to school. Then they could be like, I love the dress code. It's, you know, for this, that, and the third reason, or I hate it, but you didn't plant the seed. But when I'm talking about school, and particularly where I know that, you know, kids are in there every day, or like if you're like, you know, I know Asia just had to dip out, but if she's dealing with families or folks that are dealing with her organization on a regular basis, then I feel comfortable to ask, when's the time that you felt like we supported you well? What is the time when you felt like we didn't do so well? Because I know that there's like a plethora of examples from which they can pull. And I'm not asking them to just like rate the whole organization by coloring it by, tell me about your frustration with the Haven Center or whatever like that. That I wouldn't like that question. But does that help? Yeah, okay. Other questions about any of the tips? And I can go back to the tips if you want to see that, or about what we're about to do. I'm going to go through the instructions again. All right. Well, I think the best way to get questions is to go out there and try it. And then if it's hard, then you'll have a lot of questions for me. So what we're going to do, this is the question I want you to think about. How might you apply what you're learning about radical listening and empathy interviews to build a more equitable organization? And so you already have the cheat sheet, or hopefully you have it. You can make a copy of it, and you can write in that document, just right at the bottom or above my chart, just start drafting questions. So write for yourself, for your own benefit, put the profile, and you may have multiple profiles, by the way. You may, of people that you would like to interview, because the goal is you're going to interview tens of people, 20, 30, 40 people, right? Not just one or two. And so you could have multiple profiles, but what are some of the questions you would like to ask? And remember to tell me more or tell me about questions are great. Dig in for emotion, all of that. All right. And you're going to be in a group of a small group. So you're going to introduce yourself, then you can take some time to write on your own. And then when you both feel like you come to a good place, or all three or four, however many people in the group, then you can start sharing out. And I'm going to pop through and visit in case y'all have questions in small group. All right.
I am so sorry to pull you back in. I could tell you we're having good conversations because when I gave you your minute, no one came back right away. So I will turn it back over to Jonathan, but again, my apologies that I had to pull you back into the group. We have just about 5 minutes for some final questions, but I will let Jonathan take over from here.
Awesome. Yeah, we got raptured, and just let me get to my right page. Here we go. So yeah, let's you had a chance to engage. I got to most of the groups. I'm sorry I didn't get to meet all of you in person. But tremendous group. We all from California to Vermont to Alaska, right? So we got a healthy Montana contingent, but then we got everybody else too. So this is really dope. I'm thrilled. I want to leave us with this thought and with my contact information, so that if you want any more information or you want to stay in connection, you can. But again, remember, curb cut thinking will lead to widespread benefit, but that isn't the goal. The goal is equity for those being denied equity. So whether that is families, low-income families, whether that is families from a specific racial, ethnic community, a tribal community, women, like we don't want to lose sight of them as we do this. We want to keep them at the heart. And I heard that loud and clear in the room. So I definitely want to open up to your questions, or even just takeaways. What did you learn? If you have a question that you wrote and you want to share, yeah, Dakota, we got raptured again, but it's all good. Yeah, any questions, any thoughts, any feedback for me?
The person I was in a conversation with talked about establishing why you're having this conversation and what you're hoping to get out of it. And I thought that was an interesting thought of like knowing the purpose, and that, I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to build off something I've already learned, that kind of thing. I thought that was interesting.
That is a great point, Anna, and whoever raised that in your group. You have to think that if you have identified people who are at the margins of your organization and community, the fact that you're making the effort to sit with them and listen and ask these questions, and to really take care in stewarding their stories is going to be most likely going to be a unique experience they haven't had before. So it is a powerful thing to let them know, this is what we're doing. This is what we're hoping to gain. This is how you're going to be helpful to our organization. That's just like, they're giving you a gift, and you calling it out and setting that up in the beginning when you set the purpose of your interview is a big move. So thank you for sharing that.
I think it came up in our group that this idea, how much do we, get surveyed about how we're doing, like, or how was this? How did this land for you? How was this program, this class? And it's all very surface. And it's like, man, digging in and really getting the story when it counts, which is, like you said, identifying the people in the margins of your organization and really digging in and getting the stories and getting it takes longer. It's a conversation, but it's so powerful and important. So I appreciate just the template and the intention behind building the trust.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to share with y'all a survey. This survey will help. I'm going to share everything that we get with Jill to make, to know what's working, what didn't maybe work, and what you want next. But to Jennifer's point, especially in schools, we survey the heck out of kids and families. We do it all the time because it's very easy to do. You can just use the same survey you used last year. It doesn't create a lot of effort, and they're easy to ignore. So we see a lot of time in schools, and probably in nonprofit organizations like some that you may be familiar with, we do it so we can tell everyone we surveyed 198 participants and then nothing changes, or worse, we pull out some data that supports what we already wanted to do. So our bias guides us to the quote or to the feedback we want. We go, see, we're doing what community wants. And that I think gets old after a while. And it's why you probably see, and unless you're doing other forms of engagement, it's probably why over time you usually see survey participation go like this over the years. People are like, yeah, I did the last 7. I'm not doing these anymore. Nothing changes. When you do empathy interviews, there is still the danger that I interview Jennifer and I don't do anything. But what I feel like is that time and personal relationship, I feel like there's like a connection that I make. And now I feel so much less likely to just take that like a survey data and just, oh yeah, we did the survey, check the box, done. Like I've made a connection with this person and with the other 20 or 30 people I interviewed. And now I have a commitment. I need to make sure that I come up with something and I go back to this community to let them know what is going to be different because of the valuable stories and emotions and experiences they shared with me. So you got to remember that too. It doesn't stop at the interview. This is like a first step. After, you got to think about what are the ways that we make our learning visible so that people know that we really valued what they shared with us. Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer.
Jonathan, thank you so much for this session. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your experience, and your knowledge. This is the highest level of registration we've had since I started my job for a nonprofit cafe. So this topic was obviously really resonating with our community, and we appreciate you tuning in from the East Coast to share your knowledge and experience with us. I will send out a follow-up email to everyone that was here today with Jonathan's info and the slides and everything, as well as the link to the worksheet. So that will get out as soon as possible, as well as the recording in case you want to watch this again or share it with any of your coworkers or teammates. But thank you all for taking the time to invest in learning today for yourselves, for your organizations, and for our community. I'm so grateful. And Jonathan, seriously, huge thank you for doing this. We're so appreciative. So I hope everyone has a great Friday and a great weekend. And we will see you next month for a session on community engagement. Thank you, Jonathan.